And welcome back, everybody. I am, of course, Sinan Schwarting, live from New York City, and this is the Late Stage Podcast, episode 10. Up ahead, we have another fun episode, and of course, by fun, I mean terrifying and saddening, because this is a news podcast, and politics, I suppose. Let's just stick with news. And the news is not fun. If we lived in a better world, perhaps it would be. But we don't. And even if this world has the capacity of being better at times, this is not one of those times, sadly. I suppose I should begin my episode by apologizing for coming in a day late. Full disclosure, I have been thoroughly addicted to Zelda Breath of the Wild. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to show this on air, but it is a fantastic video game. I bought my daughter a Nintendo Switch, and I have occupied it because of this game now for quite a few days. I could probably get more viewers if I Twitch stream myself playing it, to be honest. But regardless, yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic game. Had a lot of fun playing it, and it has distracted me thoroughly. Not from the news, however. So fear not. I have plenty to report in that regard. And so speaking of which, a sip of water. If you're happening to see me on my YouTube channel, you'll see me drinking that water. I guess there's another technical note. Cue the technical note music. Usually it's for like a fact check or something, but let's make it the note from the editor. We are going to streamline the process of releasing these things. For anyone who's noticed, I always release a video version and an audio version because of the different platforms accepting one or the other. I've noticed that most of the folks who consume the podcast do so via audio version on like Spotify, Apple, whatever. And then YouTube viewers are their own thing. And so I don't really care how many viewers are registered on the one app or the other. That was probably my concern initially, but frankly, it doesn't matter. I'm going to just release the audio version for those apps so that there's only one release. And then I will release a YouTube version separately for video. So I will continue filming, but just the one release per episode should simplify things, hopefully. At least it'll cut time from between producing these episodes and releasing them, vis-a-vis the back end and editing and all that. Anyway, maybe a little too much in depth. Folks don't need to know all of that. But anyway, let's talk about the news this week instead of Zelda. Although, I mean, again, fantastic game. It has like the only other video game in my life that has captivated me to this extent was what was it called? The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. And it was already a decade ago, I suppose. In the same way, it's very immersive, open world. You're running around, getting involved in this whole world. And yeah, the folks over at the Zelda team did a knockout job. For any gamers out there, I highly recommend. I'm a little late to the game, in fact, so it's probably not news to anyone. But yeah, good fun. Even for my daughter, who's quite young, relative to like how old you're supposed to be able to sort of compute and play these games. But she's getting into it nonetheless. Good fun. Anyhow, let's talk about the news. I suppose that's the only lighthearted aspect of this episode because it goes downhill from here. So first of all, we have to talk about Africa. And speaking of highs and lows, the story of Burkina Faso has to be relayed here. It's a weird tale. So first of all, I've mentioned previously the AFCON 2021 football tournament, which has really been fantastic. And Burkina Faso is once again going on a good run. For such a small country, without the storied footballing history of a number of other African countries, such as Algeria, or Nigeria, or Ghana, or Egypt, or South Africa. I mean, there are a number of Cameroon, a number of great African sides historically that should trump Burkina Faso to getting deep into the AFCON tournament. Nonetheless, Burkina Faso has made a bit of a history of some impressive runs. They weren't in the tournament for like 20 years, from the 70s to the 90s. Came in again and have made some waves. They made it to the semifinals in like the 2010s, somewhere around there, and they made it all the way to the finals even more recently, 2013, I think it was. They were the hosts of the tournament, in fact. So it's a footballing nation that has steadily risen despite all those obstacles. Being a continent with a number of good sides, being a small country, economically not so well off, as at least relatively speaking. But so they're making another fun run of it, and another side that's been rising of late is Gabon, and they beat them in penalties in just this epic run. And I'll show a bit of a video of how it was celebrated. You can see just great stuff. They made it through the round of 16, which is a big deal for Burkina Faso, no doubt. Just great news for the country. You'd imagine celebrating all night, people very happy. And then, just a day later, unfortunately, on the 24th, other news came in from Burkina Faso. And so here is the roller coaster aspect of the story. And I hate to do this with Africa. I said early on, I didn't want Africa to be this like tales of coups and, the kind of typical stereotypes of Africa. But here we go again, unfortunately. President Roch Marc Kabore was overthrown in a military junta. He was the president from 2015, so this is year 7. Perhaps one could argue term lengths have been exceeded, but that's not really what's at stake here or what was at issue. To go into sort of more detail, by the way, and the leader, Kabore, was detained. He's supposedly safe. There are claims of no violence perpetrated in this specific coup. Obviously, that needs to be verified. And they're not necessarily being forthright in that regard. But in the days to come, perhaps there'll be more news on that front. But so they claim to have seized power. It was Captain, Sibsore Kaber Ouedraogo of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguarding and Restoration, if you will, which is, one of those monikers, who have taken power in the country. It comes in the face of increasing Islamic extremist attacks in the nation. The junta's main complaint seems to be lack of security, or concerns regarding security, and failings regarding President Kabore and his ability to lead the country in that regard specifically. So, one can't speak to the imminent fears and threats and dangers that people in Burkina Faso face and the need for change. Certainly, no one ever wants to see change made in this way. It's not a particularly democratic strategy, right? And a coup. However, it's done. And we saw, like in the case of Mali, where after a coup was taking place, or after a coup was enacted, sanctions came in immediately, and the people of Mali turned against the nation's sanctioning. So I think one has to be cautious about how they apply sanctions, if they do, or how they address this situation going forward. Make sure that they're not hurting more than helping. Tough situation, though, for sure. Burkina Faso is considered a sort of bastion of stability in the region, democratically speaking. So it's a blow. for democracy, no doubt about it. But hopefully things will progress in a positive manner as best they may. Yeah, certainly a roller coaster of emotions for the folks of Burkina Faso who experienced the thrill of victory in AFCON and then suddenly woke up to uncertainty and potential political violence, certainly instability. So my thoughts are with the people of Burkina Faso, and I hope that the claims of nonviolence are true vis-a-vis the junta. And best of luck going forward. Obviously, Islamic extremism is something that one should be combating, and if the former leader was not doing a good job of it, hopefully that is addressed. It's not really my business, I suppose. Moving on, closer to my business, perhaps, relatively speaking, being a citizen of the United States and having tons of family in various countries around the world, friends in Europe. This is big news, obviously. So, and one aspect of this story is thoroughly covered and probably doesn't belong on this podcast. I'm going to try to focus on the other part. So we've talked previously in the last episode about the Ukraine and Russia and the imminent threat of war. We talked about sanctions, right, with the SWIFT sanctions to try to maybe remove Russia from the global banking system. Should they affect a war, right? This is a real conundrum, I think, for anyone on the left, or certainly anyone who's anti-war, anti-imperialism, right? You can't be anti-imperialism or neo-colonialism, right? You can't be against these things and also not be against overt colonialism. Now, however you want to view the history and the sort of politicization of that history to create a certain narrative, I'm pretty sure fucker Carlson was on his show recently basically backing Putin, right, in his effort to take the Ukraine back into his newly imagined empire, right? They've been active already in South Ossetia once, and there's some debate about whether it's truly, can you call that neocolonialism? I mean, it's controlling your sphere of influence, right? It's dirty politics one way or another, whether they're neoliberal or colonial, or neo-colonial for that matter, which I think people often conflate with neoliberal, which is a whole other thing. In fact, I probably shouldn't have done that there because that's really more of an economic policy. But anyhow, so the struggle is, right, like if you're against neocolonialism or imperialism or empire building, right, you kind of have to be against Putin's efforts to reclaim land based on some historical mumbo jumbo, right? And yet, what do you then support, right? Do you support the United States and the UK and folks trying to perhaps warmonger on the other side? Right, there are a lot of people who might want to save their skin politically by having a war to deal with rather than all the nonsense there is here on the domestic front. There are always war hawks, neocons, right? The like folks who love war and profiteering off of it, who just are going to inherently advocate for war regardless. So you've got two sides here that one should have no desire to be on. Where does that leave us, right? That's my question, and I don't yet have an answer for it. I'd like to keep reporting on this story if I can, and perhaps have experts come on and inform us, locals ideally, so that we can really have an informed opinion and maybe answer that question. Where should we be siding in this scenario? It's not easy, right? Like we've talked at length about, I have talked at length about the dual nature of sanctions. And of course, there's an effective sanction and an ineffective sanction. And then beyond that, a sanction that can be too expensive, right? And we've talked about the people starving in Afghanistan as a product of poorly applied sanctions. Or Iran, right, during the pandemic, folks who couldn't get the vaccine or get necessary medical treatment because of sanctions placed on them, right? You don't want to punish people and create humanitarian crises and be responsible for deaths. That's never the good guys of any side. So it's a very complex question that I don't really have an answer for. Hopefully in starting to look into the story here, and then in future episodes with perhaps some informed guests, we can come to a satisfactory conclusion in that regard. Now, what we do have is some more news. The United States and the United Kingdom have withdrawn embassy, diplomats, cleared out embassies, basically signaling that war is coming, war is imminent. Interestingly, the EU has not done that. And in fact, they've kind of, I don't want to journalize here, be a journalist in this regard, or editorialize, but I mean, really, they've sort of mocked that. And they've gone so far as saying that there's no need to dramatize, that's a quote, the situation by doing this, by sort of fleeing and emptying your embassies, because they're still in talks that are fruitful. The Ukrainians have come out forcefully against what the United States and the United Kingdom have done, saying that there's absolutely no reason to think that war is imminent, that there's no way to get out of it diplomatically. Many well-read, well-versed editorialists and writers have spoken at length about how it seems very clear that Russia's aim is to create talks, is to create channels of communication through this aggressive act. Where it leads, what they want from that, who knows? But certainly one has to avoid war, and one has to avoid being too capitulatory, right? You don't want to be the next Neville Chamberlain. So it's a tough balancing act, no doubt. But it's one that needs to be done. You can't just sit back and not do it. And so I think fleeing the country preemptively was a potentially cowardly move, unless it's calculated, right? Unless folks at this point want said war, which would be terrible, obviously. I would not be for that. So yeah, it looks like bad moves made by the United States and the United Kingdom. Regarding war, that should not be much of a mistake or much of a rather surprise. Seen lots of bad moves militarily before. And that's not new to this Biden administration either. I'm not trying to play that card. That's systemic. Since Vietnam, I mean, not to open old wounds, but anyway, that's what we have now. And again, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky slammed the move by the United States and United Kingdom. The United States have additionally added both Ukraine and Russia to the no travel list. The State Department has done that, signaling again, right, that there's this imminent threat, danger. It's all posturing at this point, it looks like, by everyone. Certainly, Putin can't be declared innocent in that regard either. So, yeah, it's a conundrum. It should be a conundrum anyway, right? There should be no easy allies in this type of debate or whatever it is that you call this, if there's really anything debatable at all. But let's move on to Asia, in fact. We're going to be focusing sort of heavily on the Middle East this episode, sadly, we could say. So first of all, and I'll just touch on this because the Weird of the Week got an update. I was going to add this as the Weird of the Week and do this really briefly. So I'll try to keep it still brief, but the Weird of the Week has been updated thanks to Mr. Carlson and his M&M obsession. So first of all, we've got to talk about Yemen, and I've yet to mention it on my podcast. It's a humanitarian crisis. Speaking of humanitarian crises, the Saudi military has been bombing Yemen for quite a while now, and it's created various humanitarian crises that have been called out by almost every international organization that has the ability to call such a thing out. Blinken, Secretary Blinken, has oddly sort of hedged the U.S. out of the conversation, spoken about how, there's such misfortune and terrible things happening and humanitarian crisis, this conflict has to stop. And he's still pointed at the Houthi rebels of Yemen more than Saudis, of course, but he's sort of spoken of the outright abject misery of the people of Yemen and how sad it is that this is occurring and how there needs to be an end to this, without mentioning the fact that not only are the Saudis the ones creating this humanitarian crisis and bombing the crap out of these people, and basically they're on the verge of eradicating them, they are doing so 100% with the backing of the United States, bombing with people from the United States military, with 100% U.S. supplies that they've paid for and are bought. So the United States is funding and executing much of the bombing that these people are suffering from. They were just there was a blackout in Yemen for 4 days. They came out of it for a day, and then there was more bombing in the capital of Yemen, in Sana'a, by Saudi, US, and United Arab Emirates forces collectively. So it's just very odd to hear Blinken, speak about this terror campaign, essentially, in this third person, like over there, this is tragedy occurring, as if the United States isn't a key contributor. If not, frankly, there have been a number of well-written pieces that are out there saying very overtly that it's the United States who's enabling all of this. Without the United States' funding and executing bombings, this would not be possible. So we can't just sort of sit back and say, oh, it's so sad what's happening to the people of Yemen. That's on us. That's on the United States. You've got to stop. You've got to stop helping the Saudis. And while the Saudis tank the economy via inflation because they're by machinating oil prices, you're funding and executing a war for them and talking about how sad it is that the humanitarian crisis that's produced as a result of that war is a tragedy. I'm not convinced. Sorry. So yes, that's tragedy number one out of Asia. Out of the Middle East, more specifically. Absolutely a tragedy. He's right on that front. Certainly a humanitarian crisis. It absolutely needs to stop. Apologies for the street sounds. Welcome to New York podcasting. But so, yeah, I hope it's over as soon as possible. And I think it's good, I guess, in a way that it's getting attention again. It's something that President Biden promised, in the run-up to being elected, that he was going to cut out and stop. So could you please? That would be nice. It really is something that the United States, of all the various atrocities that have been perpetrated sort of in the satellite of the United States, if not by us, this is just one. We don't need this. And certainly if you want to claim to be better than the last guy, right? Here's a way to prove it very easily. Go. Stop funding the terrorism of people of Yemen. Moving on. Also in that region, and we're focusing on Israel, and this is just a thing, a concept, a sphere of the world that I have tried so hard to avoid. I actually think that Israel and Palestine is more nuanced than people give it credit for being. It's not as simplistic. With that said, of course, I am incredibly sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. Again, if you're going to talk about neo-colonialism and people being removed from the land, ethnic cleansing, right? There's lots of that very obviously happening. And laws being very clearly broken, right? Vis-a-vis kibbutzes and settlers coming to the lands that have been agreed that people shouldn't be in. And so this whole religious war that's played out, there's a side that's quite clearly wrong, no matter what side of this sort of actual geopolitical conflict that you want to take on it. With that said, this story I felt like needed some attention because it's tragic and it is a microcosm of the story at large that, and again, I talked about when the Pope talked about cancel culture in a previous episode, how cancel culture is a thing that always existed without that name when it came to people on the kind of left or that spoke out on certain issues, especially. And one of those issues was being pro-Palestine. The journalist whose name I forgot, his name was Mark Lamont Hill. He was fired from CNN for being vocally sympathetic to Palestine on air. Folks from Colombia were denied the ability to speak and had their removed from their jobs as a product of Bari Weiss coming out against them, right? So people were being canceled on that side of things well before that was a term. With that said, in 2008, a Haifa University professor was canceled. I'm not going to mention names or anything like that. I think it's a story that if you have enough interest in, you can look up, and I'll tell you why in a moment, but it's not the focus. But a professor was fired from his job. He got another job in England, Exeter, for not long later. So he's not much later, rather. So he's fine. But he was canceled, right? Because his student did his dissertation on Tantura, a village which the student claimed and researched thoroughly, as one would for their dissertation, their thesis. There was a massacre, right? That was the claim, that the people of Tantura, the Palestinians, were massacred by what he referred to as Zionist gangs. And I think, again, we're talking about kibbutzes and settlers and folks who took sort of the law into their own hands in this purge of Palestinians as Israelis started claiming lands that were given to them, in 1948. With all of that said, the student who wrote the dissertation was forced to retract his work from a public campaign of intimidation, violence threatened. The professor lost his job because he supported the student and backed up his work. And it was largely swept under the rug from there. Certainly, it hardly made the airwaves here in the United States. Perhaps for folks who focus on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and all that, there was more attention. But certainly, as far as the mainstream goes, it was not really even present there to begin with. Fast forward now to this recent week, a number of former soldiers have come out and admitted that they, previous to joining the military in 1948, and the claim is on May 22nd and 23rd, 1948, massacred innocent, surrendered, as a matter of fact, civilians, and buried them in mass graves. The tragedy goes a little deeper. So there was a battle, right, between these settlers and locals who inhabited the village of Tantura. The village, by the way, is on the Mediterranean coast of Israel, just north of Caesarea, right? For the sake of historicity, right? Caesarea was a Roman town created on the beachside in history, right? The Romans, just again, for the sake of giving you some historical clarity as far as all the stuff that's happened in this region. But so just north of Caesarea was this village of Tantura where Palestinians had lived and were forcibly removed by settlers in 1948. There were multiple such massacres in 1948. Palestinians refer to it as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, as it's translated directly. In this time frame, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes and their land during this reclamation of the land by Israelis, newly termed. Anyway, all of this trickles into the present day, where apparently there's a popular beach now in that area. It's called Dor Beach. And they found underneath the parking lot at least 200 people's remains in a number of mass graves where people's bodies were thrown after the massacre. So it's basically now confirmed. And of course, for the professor whose job was lost and the student whose dissertation was revoked or whatever, retracted, that brings them a bit of justice. But it's worth noting, and the reason I'm not going too far into their stories, Palestinians have made this claim for decades now. Since it occurred, they've said this happened. They have been rejected. They've been denied. They've been made a fool of. They've been erased from the conversation. And so, it's interesting that we even have to mention this story, that it's come to light through these Israeli academics who did their dissertation work and research, which just verified what people have said they experienced since it occurred. So their voices should be elevated, I think. The story of people who experienced ethnic cleansing, at the very least, right? For the same reason we need to hear stories about the Holocaust and what occurred to Jews in Europe. Like, everyone needs to know this, future generations, right? We have to keep that knowledge alive so that we can prevent it from occurring again. And it's any form of ethnic cleansing. And it's more important to note, in fact, that some of the most vocal critics of this colonization, the settler movements, of Palestinian rights, vocalizing support for those, are Israeli Jews in Israel. And I think the majority of those people are Israeli Jews in Israel. And so that's another important side note for the whole conversation at large, right? This is a nuanced conversation, and people in that region are sorting it out on both sides. So it's why I don't really weigh in much. I think one has to be careful how they report these things, because we know how we feel individually, right? And we know that that's going to influence what we report and how we view things. So we have to take as balanced a stance as we can. But this is now a verified news story that confirms a narrative that was denied for decades of ethnic cleansing and massacres and murder, mass murder, in the name of religion, in the name of conquering land and colonial aspirations of that nature, right? Taking land for yourself from someone else. Conquest. So hopefully justice is found for those folks whose story, not only for those folks who were murdered and those impacted by that, but for those folks whose story was denied all this time as well, and who were made to feel crazy for knowing what actually happened. The Cassandra thing, right? You know the truth, but nobody will hear it. It's devastating. Anyhow, moving on, finally, to North America. And I thought this was an important story, also tragic, because what else, right? What else is new? There was another story of migrants capsizing in their attempt to come across borders. In this case, it was to the United States. So, we've pointed to England, like sort of surprise events, people capsizing, trying to cross the channel. And I had a guest, Dennis Opal, on to talk about that and its connection to Brexit. Now here, there was a boat, 40 people, not one of them with a life jacket on, unfortunately. capsized. None of them found but one who was clinging onto the boat. He was found on Tuesday by a Good Samaritan off the coast of Florida, off the Atlantic coast. Specifically, for anyone who wants to know, in the Fort Pierce Inlet. But so that one person was found clinging onto the boat on Tuesday. The boat had capsized apparently on Saturday night. So that man was resilient, we can say. But clearly the tragedy is that 39 people have very likely lost their lives or are missing at the very least. And apparently, the story here is that this is a product of human smuggling. Not folks from the Bahamas, you would imagine, perhaps some, but it's a means for folks from Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. So a number of Caribbean nations who are finding new avenues into the United States, and so they're apparently taking refuge in the Bahamas briefly, and then so it staggers out the trip, I suppose. I can't explain the logic of it, obviously, but it's obviously a tragedy. 39 lives lost, 39 folks seeking a better life and losing their lives in the process. And it speaks again to how those problems that I mentioned overseas in Europe exist here too, and we just don't really hear much about them. There are very impoverished nations in our backyard, quote unquote, that need legitimate help, that have suffered tremendously as a product of the COVID era that we've all suffered in, that are also experiencing inflation, although it feels way worse when you have less to work with, right? When you're in a deeper hole to begin with. So empathy should be the guiding principle here. I'm sure it won't be for many. But anyway, that's it for the news here. Now to the weird of the week. And my apologies to Oceania and Latin America. I mean, I guess we kind of got the Americas covered generally in that story about the Bahamas and folks trying to migrate from elsewhere through the Bahamas. But yeah, we'll cover the other continents in upcoming weeks, of course, naturally. Now, the weird of the week. This has to be, there can be no other one. And I was gonna, like I said, I was gonna give it to Anthony Blinken for claiming that there's this tragedy in Yemen. Something should be done when we're the ones essentially creating it. Or like I said, at least funding and often executing. But so the weird of the week is gonna go to Tucker Carlson, who is, and his ilk, if you will, anyone else in his camp that is truly concerned about the green M&M or the brown M&M. I'm not familiar enough with the M&M multiverse. But so one of the M&Ms in the ad is a female M&M, a lady, and she is being made to have less sex appeal somehow. And by which this is, of course, they're putting her in different shoes. So obviously that's the main determinant, apparently, for some folks as far as a woman's sex appeal. She's got to be in heels. But so she's being taken out of heels, and this has driven a number of conservatives up the wall. Like, they're fuming, and Tucker Carlson is at the top of the list. Just can't get beyond the fact that they're trying to make the M&M less sexy. And I mean, I gotta be honest, dude, like, I wasn't attracted to the M&M sexually. And I don't know anyone else who was, and if I did, I'd there's a reason I wouldn't know, because they wouldn't be too proud of that fact. I wouldn't go down this route personally. Like, it doesn't seem, in all the culture war conflicts, you're probably even gaining ground on a number of them because you're playing off folks' ignorance. But I don't think you're gonna get a lot of folks behind you on the like make M&M sexy again train. So if you're out there, Tucker Carlson, I doubt you're hearing what I have to say, but tone it down, bro. This is not a good look. Anyway, that's it for this episode. The weirdo of the week. was apparently really into M&Ms. I don't know. See you around next week. Hope, again, next week brings better news. Peace out, everyone.